You're listening to What Brings You In, a weekly series featuring psychology talk with therapists Ryan and Carrie. Have something to say? Want your question answered? Visit ryananswers.com/podcast to get in touch.
So welcome to the show. We're going to be talking about grief today. You can find the show notes at ryananswers.com/podcast. So people, when you talk about grief, they almost always think of death.
Yes.
Right? They're kind of...
And death of a loved one.
Death of a loved one especially. That's kind of like what people equate with grief. And then you have this model, the 5-step.
Kubler-Ross.
Starts with denial.
Denial.
Anger. Bargaining. Depression. Acceptance. Right. And so I remember when I was in school, I learned about this not through like a class, but through my own personal counseling experience. So my dad went totally unexpectedly when I was, I think I was 21 or 22. So super, super young. He was 52. And so I went and saw this counselor, and he's telling me about this model. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know if that really fits with me. And he's like, well, you know, Kubler-Ross, Elizabeth was this doctor's name, this psychiatrist. She said she didn't go through her own stages, but I did a bit of looking into it, and her quote was actually about clarifying those stages don't represent what happens after somebody dies. It's people who are coping with their own death through terminal illness. So it's been often kind of people throw that out there of, oh yeah, you're going to go through these stages, and you know that's how you process things. So tell everybody about what it means to process, because I remember being like 21 and going through this stuff and being like, I have to process, and then be like, I have no idea what that is at all.
Yeah.
So what when therapists say processing feelings, processing loss, like what are we talking about?
To me, that means finding meaning. So when I process things in my own life, or when I help other people process, that means kind of understanding first what the first interpretation of the event was. So how did I internalize it? How did I read it? How did I face it? Because generally we're talking about past events, right? So how did I face it? And then what did I learn from it? Sometimes we learn great things, and sometimes we learn terrible things from experience. So what did I learn? And then what meaning does this bring to my life currently? So what did I carry along with me? And that's what it means to process, to see what emotions were going on, body reaction, right, during the event and then afterwards.
The question that I always get from people that I will reflect to you now is, how does that help? So I'm heartbroken, and I come and talk to you, and you help me discover meaning, and you help me to figure out what it is that I'm going through and I'm feeling. Like, so what?
But you're not fixing anything, right? You're not bringing my loved one back. You're not bringing the relationship back. Nothing's changing outside this.
Right. So how does this system, or this procedure of processing feelings, how does that help people?
So I can talk from a personal experience. So when I process things, what it allows me is I feel more in charge of my life. So it's not that life is living me, or I'm kind of surviving, or I'm being swept away, which is kind of what I felt before I processed things. Like I'm powerless. Chaos. I don't even know what's going on. It gives me a sense of ownership over my life. Okay. Right? And the sense of ownership, like when you own a house or when you own a car, it's very much yours. So then you feel like you belong to yourself. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Well, it does to me, because I've been through that and I know what you mean. But maybe we can expand on it for people who may not be able to resonate with that from a personal perspective. To belong to yourself, what does it mean to not belong to yourself?
So for me, not belonging to myself is kind of, I can react without an explanation. So if you ask me, why are you mad? I don't know, would be my response. If I'm not in charge of myself, if I don't belong to myself.
Or you would give an answer that is not entirely accurate. You'll bring up some secondary issue, let's put it that way. You'll say, I'm mad because of X, when really there's like this deep simmering stuff going on. And if you don't know about that, like Carrie's talking about, you can't process it, then it just stays there. Right? That's kind of the effect to me of not processing.
And also it's like compounding, right? So maybe if I hadn't processed, I also lost my father. I lost my father last year. And if I hadn't processed a little bit about what that meant to me, then maybe even now I would have issues with certain things, right? So it's only been a year, and I still have times where I'm like overwhelmed by grief.
That's so recent.
But if I didn't give myself permission to be overwhelmed by grief and maybe cry in front of my children or cry in front of my husband or literally leave a room for a second and then come back, then I don't think I could navigate socially if I didn't give myself permission to process that emotion, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people that I work with, I don't know if it's something specific to this area or if it's just that people are very uncomfortable culturally with grief and death and dying. But many people really want to hide a lot from their kids, too much.
Yeah.
Because if your kids, here's the backstory to that and where I'm coming from. If your kids don't see you cry ever,
they won't have permission to cry.
Right. They don't have permission to cry. They don't think it's okay. They'll question themselves. They'll question why they're doing it. If somebody makes fun of them for crying, they will probably buy into that because they've never seen you do it.
Yeah.
So having healthy expression. So obviously if you're, in a very distraught, emotionally damaged, distraught state, and that's all the time, and you're crying all the time, and there's dysfunction, that's not healthy to show your kids because that will be very destabilizing for them.
Yeah.
But if we're talking like an event that is proportional, like if you go through a sad event and you have a sad response, there's nothing
human.
There's nothing imbalanced about that. It's exactly human, totally. We've even been focusing on grief in the framework of death, but to me, grief is a reaction or a series of steps you take following loss.
Yes, I agree.
So there are many types of loss. And so I think it's really important. One thing that helps me to process is to break down exactly what it is that I have lost. So to think about the different ways that you can have loss, think about you can lose a person, you can lose
a relationship,
you can lose parts of yourself.
Yeah.
And to be specific, because I know a lot of people will probably be like, well, what does that even mean? Well, say, for example, that you feel you're going to be a great success, and then you hit a certain age and your life's not panning out the way that you thought it would.
So you lost that part of you.
You lost that part of you and the way that you thought things would be.
Age, too, like not being...
Like losing your youth.
Losing your youth, right?
You can lose...
your beauty, your youth. I also think that I know that there's untangible loss. So, for example, if you didn't have a good childhood,
yes,
that's a loss.
You never have a chance.
You're never going to have a good childhood.
And you can think, and there are more people than I think anybody would really realize. I would say like 20 to 30% of clients we see somewhere in that neighborhood has some element of that. Because if you grew up with dysfunctional parents and you're bitter about it, or you say things like, well, I want to give my kids a better life, there's probably some level of that you're experiencing. Death.
There's also perpetual loss, right? So, for example, specifically from the way I understand is like the loss of a child is a perpetual loss.
Oh, yeah.
There's not even a name for that. Like if we think about it, when you lose a spouse, what do you call the person that lost? A widower.
A widow, right.
If you lose a parent, what do you call it? An orphan. If you lose a child.
I'd never thought of that. That's like a shower thought.
There's no name because it's just unimaginable. Like it's just an unimaginable loss, right? Huh. And it's a perpetual loss because when their friends graduate from high school, your kid didn't graduate,
triggered.
Right?
Yeah.
It's a loss forever.
So just to touch on that word trigger, there are things that remind you or activate pain that you have experienced. So if you've lost like a parent and then you drive past the ice cream shop that you always went to, that would be a trigger. So Carrie's saying like when you lose a child, there's just like a never ending
sorrow
amount of
everything.
Trigger.
It's really tough to do.
Right? It's really hard to do. And a lot of times too, there's another type of loss where you can lose somebody before they're actually physically gone.
It's true.
And
like Alzheimer's.
That's a great example. It's not where I was going, but that's a really good one because that person is not accessible to you anymore.
Yeah.
And they never will be.
Yeah.
And so having this disconnect because you're so used to associating a physical person with
certain personality,
right, that you love or that you know, and learning that that's not the case. This is just like a vehicle, right? We're up here. That's hard. So it was my first or second year, and I was seeing this one client, and her mom had a terminal illness, and she paused, and it was one of those pauses where somebody wants to say something, but they have some kind of apprehension, right? They think you're going to judge them, or maybe they're going to cry, or maybe it is something offensive, whatever it is. So we talked about it, and I encouraged her that this is a safe space. There's zero judgment. You don't have to worry about my personal opinions. I'm here as a professional. And she's like, well, I kind of want her to die. because I feel like I've already grieved, and that hit me in a big way, because that was the first time. I was young. I think I was 23 or 22 at this point, and I hadn't really considered that you can grieve for a loss before the person actually is gone.
Yeah.
That
it's also smart. It's a strong lesson to not say sorry right before. Like we're like conditioned to say someone dies and we say, "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss." I do it now even, but when I'm in this space, I don't, because you have no idea if this person.
Right. You don't know if they're happy about it.
If they're happy about it, if they're guilty about it, because they feel responsible for the death. You don't know if they're relieved, if they're happy, if they're joyful, if they're terrified of it. You don't know what the emotion is going to be.
So that loss was something that the processing for her was not, I need to process my mother's death. It was the loss of her feeling like she was a good person. She now felt like she was a bad person because she wanted her mom to was on edge for months, and her mother had outlived her prognosis. And so it went from being, oh, I'm so scared you're going to go, to I'm tired of feeling scared. I'm tired of feeling anxious. And I just want you to go already, because you're not going to get better. And you're in pain. And you're in pain. Yeah. And I'm in pain. And I'm sick of dealing this. It's taking a toll on my marriage or myself, my life. Yeah. And so helping her to deal with that was what you would process. So that would be, again, the caregiver burnout, right? Yeah. So there are many different forms of that. And loss can take all kinds of different shapes. It can have all kinds of effects. And I think that with every loss, there is a gain as well. Like post-traumatic growth kind of thing, are you referring to? I'm talking more in the sense of, so I took macroeconomics as one of my electives in school. What?
It's an interesting class.
Yeah, did you?
I would never take that. No. Okay. I don't even understand what the words that you just said mean. Right.
Macroeconomics is the study of like large-scale economic forces. Okay. So don't worry, I'm not talking about anything to do with those. I'm talking about a very specific concept I pulled from that really stuck with me. It's the term opportunity cost. Okay. Most people, so you're familiar with that term, I would assume. Most people are. So opportunity cost is the idea that for every decision you make, you have to forego some other decision.
Of course.
So when you're talking about a loss, so you lose a pet, tragic, but then you gain freedom. You don't have to have somebody watch your pet if you travel. You don't have to take care of your pet. So for everything you do, there's this kind of other side of things.
I also think that one of the things that taught me the most in life and probably changed my relationship, other than learning about attachments, which we talked in episode 1, but another thing that changed my relationship with my husband tremendously was one of my friends, actually, when she was 32, she died of something like she had like an aneurysm, and her husband was 33. They had 3 small children, like I had at that time. Wow. and since that moment, which was 5 years ago already, or maybe no, less years. Every time I have a fight because they had a huge fight right before she passed.
Oh no.
I know. And it was about something stupid, probably like who's going to drive the kids to and from something. And since that fight, because I talked to him a lot afterwards as a friend, just like helping him through, and I was actually helping him tell his kids that their mother had passed, because he wanted to tell them that they were on a trip and stuff like that. I told him, no, we have to tell them about reality. We have to tell them their mom's not coming home.
Yeah, you can't tell them their kids.
No, you can't. You have to tell them. But it's scary, right? Telling a 4-year-old that their mom.
How do you? I can't imagine.
Yeah, but we had, like, he did. I was there with him, but he did. And since that time, Ryan, every time I have a fight, or I'm about to have a fight, because I get angry with my husband, I think.
You get angry at your husband?
I do. He knows I do. And I get angry. I think, would this be something that I would fight about if I know he would be dying tomorrow? And 99.9% of the times, there are those 0.1 where I will fight. I won't fight, right? Because it just gives, like, death gives life perspective in everything.
It does.
In everything. So our interactions. I was just with a friend of mine that had a girl from their school lost a mom in a car crash. And I said, this is a great opportunity for all those girls to appreciate their mothers, like to appreciate their family. Like if you just take a little bit and just, okay, let's embrace the fear of death. Okay, what can I learn from death?
Does it change, do you find, depending on when it occurs? Like, have your responses changed if you have lost, if you don't mind me asking a personal question, have your responses changed if you lose somebody as a teenager to a 20-year-old to a 30-year-old?
Yeah, I think so. I would say so. I think probably because I was more capable of coping with it as I got older, so I could process it more. Again, we're saying that word again. So I could process it more, so I could get meaning. I could sit with my emotion. I wasn't scared of it when I was younger. I lost my great-grandmother, who was a very big part of our lives, in my life. And I remember not even really thinking that she had died. I was 10, I think, and I was like,
well,
like I didn't even really understand the meaning of it.
Proximity, I think, matters too.
Yeah.
Like, I lost my rabbit last week, which it's a rabbit, right? Like some of my friends would be like, it's a fucking rabbit, dude. They live 6 years tops. They're a prey animal. Like, you make them in a stew, like, get over it, would kind of be the message. But it wasn't I'm not that old. I just turned 32, so for perspective. But when I was younger, I was more insulated from losses because you have older family members who they are the ones who are on the front lines, right?
Yeah.
They're absorbing most of the pain, most of the kind of gritty details. They're making the plans. They're doing all the hard stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful for that because I cannot imagine having to do those things at a younger age. So even though it was, quote unquote, just a rabbit, to be holding something as it dies, which is what happened in my case, was so hard and so different from different
Everything
forms of loss. Oh man, yeah, crushing. And even in terms of that kind of blocking, like we talked about, what prevents you from speaking of it, it was, I would say, as powerful in terms of the raw emotion and how hurt I was to losing any human I've ever lost. And that's something I found difficult to say. Even now, I feel like I shouldn't.
We don't have permission to do that.
No, I shouldn't say that because that's like offensive to your family. I know it isn't, but that's one of those things where there's this idea that your sadness is proportional to how much you cared or loved. I am just learning now with this most recent loss in my life that is not true.
No.
There's so many other factors: proximity, your age, your ability to talk it through or process it, who supports you. Like, there are so many factors. So if anybody out there is listening and feels like there's a loss which you think is too insignificant, or that you need to suck it up, that's a dangerous thing to say to yourself, because that can get you stuck.
I think that we have to accept, I think we've talked about this before too, that we are created in such a way, like we are human beings and there's so many parts of us, and they all are not, like, we can't live without a heart, we can't live without a liver, we can't live without emotions. So if I'm having a reaction to something, that's valuable. I have to see why I'm having it.
Yes, that's the gist of it. And some people say that, well, I don't want to do that, it's uncomfortable. Yes, we're not saying it isn't uncomfortable.
It is.
Like, trust me, it
sucks.
It
sometimes
sucks. Coming in here today and just talking about and revisiting, all the terrible losses we've suffered isn't really like a super fun episode, to be totally honest with you. We were having like a way funner, more light convo before we started. But it's something that's important. People need to talk about this stuff. And there's that whole Bell Let's Talk. Have you seen that? No. The Bell is a telecommunications company here, and they sponsor a certain day, a mental health day. And for every time somebody shares their little post that says, let's talk about mental health, we will
beautiful.
Donate, I think it's 10 cents a share or something. But the thing that kind of gets me, and why I really wanted to do this episode and why this podcast, is I find it's a very virtuous message. Let's talk about it. Everybody talks about talking about it, but very few people talk about it.
Yeah.
Because it's hard. It is uncomfortable. It's not really like high on your to-do list.
Yeah, it's hard.
It's not. There's a million other things you'd rather do than go pay somebody to dig through the crap of your life and leave feeling like emotionally. Therapy is very draining.
The other day I was at the supermarket and I asked this lady, she had a really pretty necklace with like babies on them. And I said, "Oh, how many kids do you have?" And she said, "I have 3 alive and 1 dead."
It's a very interesting answer.
I know.
I've never heard that before.
And I stood there for a second. I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do. Like, I kind of started panicking. And then I said, well, I said, the 4 babies on your necklace look beautiful. And she said, yes, they were beautiful. And then she told me the one that had passed away's last name. This is on the line to buy groceries. Yeah.
Because you're a therapist, you could sense it.
But I thought maybe that was beautiful that this woman, 1, could say it, because maybe most people wouldn't. And 2, that I was able to let her talk about her son.
Yeah. You don't go into fixing mode.
No,
right?
I just said, oh,
like that panicky feeling that you described, I think is probably the most common reaction people would have, and most people would succumb to that and try to comfort, solve, or escape.
Yeah. Yeah, and I said, what was his name? And she told me his name, and what did he do? And he was a pilot. Right, and then okay, great. And
this wasn't a baby.
No.
This was like a grown person.
Yeah, grown person. Yeah, and then she left.
Went about her day.
And went about her day, and I went about my day.
How do you recognize if you're a non-processor? Like if you're one of those people who bottles. One of the things about bottling is you bottle the fact that you bottle, so you don't even know that you're doing that. And so you would hear this and be like, yeah, that sucks for people who do that.
But you're probably doing it too.
Meanwhile, you're probably doing it. How do people recognize that? What are the symptoms?
I would say that if someone were to ask you, how are you feeling? You wouldn't be able to name the emotion. Mm-hmm. So ignorance on what your emotional state is. If you answer fine, good, bad, no.
Like very generic.
What does that mean? Right? So if you're bottling, you'll tend to be very vague with emotions.
I think also if you have anxiety around being vulnerable,
another great.
I think it's much easier to tell if you're a bottler if you are married or in a very close relationship. I think
because
you'll probably get a very specific set of complaints. So I think for when I approach this, it's usually men, usually avoidant men, as we discussed in our first episode, who are bottlers. What I would usually do to help that person gain awareness is I would ask them how their partners see them and why their partners would have those complaints. So if your partner is saying, I can't talk to you, or you don't talk to me, or I don't know what you're thinking.
Or they ask constantly, what's wrong? I can see something's wrong. What's wrong? I can see something's wrong.
The complaint from the bottler would be, my wife is constantly nagging me, or she always starts things, or she always wants to talk. And the partner's complaint would be the exact opposite. He never wants to talk.
Yeah.
He never tells me what's going on. I don't know what's happening, and I feel alone. So if you're hearing those things from your partner, or you're saying those things, that's another big clue.
All right. Well, thank you for listening. I know it's a difficult conversation. Thank you, Ryan, for let's bringing it up and talking about death and what grief looks like. So you can find the show notes at ryananswers.com, and I hope you'll hear us again.
Yes, and if you enjoy our conversations, we are here weekly. So subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and thanks everyone for listening.